Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today we are discussing The Silver Trumpet by Owen Barfield. The format today. So firstly, if you have not read this book, please read it first. Please, we have done a great reading of the book, which I'm going to put down here in the YouTube. So you can go ahead and listen to it first. There are going to be spoilers throughout. So do that first and then come back here. Okay, let's get started. Format today is I'm going to do a very short talk just about the silver trumpet and the sound. And then I'm going to invite first everybody who has read, because they did such a magnificent job, and I'm so grateful to them, to talk about what they got from the book. The original question was, what is Owen Barfield saying in this book? But you can talk about anything you got from the book, anything that you found interesting. You can also put questions that you have on the table. You can take up to 5 minutes to take your time to make your points. After everybody has made the points, only people who have read the whole book or listened to the whole book. Then I'll organize all of that, and then we're going to have a discussion. All right. So let me start by talking about the silver trumpet and the sound, because it's really about the sound. Okay. Now, Penny was wonderful in, doing the sound. So I tried to figure out how to do the sound, and I'm going to use the sound of the trumpet. I said, okay, what should the sound be? What we have done is we have been studying these three cultures, the Western culture, Chinese culture, and the Indian culture. So I wanted a sound that would fit all three. So I've used a pentatonic scale, which is commonly used in Chinese music. It's also the Raag Bhoop in the Indian tradition, and it's a subset of the Ionian scale. It is the most clear, bright, serenely joyful sound, okay, that I know. So let me start. Rooty tootity 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 too 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 tootity 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 too rooty too. That's the sound that I'm going to use. So again, let me do it one more time. Rooty tootity 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 too 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 rootity too rooty too. So the scale is, in Indian, it is sa re ga pa dha sa dha pa ga re sa 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 sa. So it is like C, D, E, G, A, C, like that. Okay, so it's a very simple pentatonic scale, which is used in Chinese music, and this is called the Raag Bhoop in Indian tradition. So the great thing about this is that I have a whole bunch of compositions, so I can do a whole bunch of variations on this silver trumpet, and it's all about the sound. So I'm going to use the sound as a device in this meetup. So I'm going to now invite first the readers from this Sunday to volunteer to talk for 5 minutes about what they got from this book, and they're welcome to put any questions on the table. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to get started. We're going to start with Evanique. So let me do an introduction. Rooty tootity 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 too 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 tootity 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 too rooty too Evanique. Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. So one of the first things I noticed when I started reading this was light and shadow, right? Or light and dark. And I noticed it in obviously Gambetta and Violetta. Um, and even even when the Lord, he renamed them Gamboy and Violet. Gamboy, just the name Gamboy, it just feels hard. Like it just feels like this is going to be the hardcore one. And Violetta, or Violet, just seemed like she's more whimsical, right? So light, airy. But if you go into the story, um, one of the things I noticed is that when Violet gets the trumpet from Prince Courtesy, she's very flippant about it, right? Like she's just very casual. He explains to her the seriousness of this trumpet, and even when she realizes that she left it downstairs, she doesn't bother to go get it. And so I noticed that, and I noticed that Gamboy is more calculated, right? Like she's very much, she would take it seriously, and she saw an opportunity because this trumpet was controlling her. So when she saw the first opportunity to get rid of it, she did. And it's so funny because I think Violet is seen as like the good, right? Like if you do the classic fairy tale of good and bad, Violet's good, Gamboy's bad. But I think it's deeper than that, right? I think Violet has these tendencies to be absent-minded and um, to not take things so seriously, where Gamboy understands the seriousness of situations. Now, the difference is that if those two were to combine, like if those two personalities were to combine, it would make a powerful woman who is full of joy and full of whimsy, but yet understands the seriousness of life and gets things done. Because I think one of the things it's easy to do is to make Gamboy just total, like the total villain of it, right? As they do in classic story tales. But as we know from studying Young, that when we look at fairy tales, the light and shadow are one, right? They're one. And so we can see that in Gamboy and Violetta, or Violet, that they seem like they're one, right? Like it's like the light and shadow are fighting each other, instead of like the shadow, instead of like the light embracing the shadow and bringing that into being. Jordan Peterson talks about light and shadow, but he uses the Lion King and Mufasa and Scar. And it's like when the light doesn't pay attention to the shadow takes over. And I think that's what happens in this story, is that Gamboy takes over. We can see that throughout the story, where Gamboy becomes queen and starts taking over the land, and then everybody's kind of miserable because that shadow went unchecked, right? So because the shadow goes unchecked, that's what happens. But um you can see, like, once the balance is restored, like once that trumpet is found, and I think you said it so eloquently, the trumpet is the center. Like once that center is found again, you see the balance coming back. And you can see that at the end of the story, sorry guys, spoilers, um when at the end, where Violet comes back to life, and Gamboy and the body in the grave suddenly transitions into Gamboy, that's where you see, it folds. And like in the end, they say some of it is that they don't believe that Gamboy ever existed, which is the question that I'm putting on the table. It's the main question that I have, is that, do you think Violet and Gamboy are one? Or do you think that they're really two separate sisters? Because I have a theory about that. So I just want to hear other people's thoughts on that. Um, and I have a note here that, you know, uh, it just reminds me of Frozen and Anna and Elsa. And Elsa has something happen when she's little, and then she cuts herself off from the world. And I don't think Gamboy does that in a sense, but she cuts herself off from people. She doesn't allow the trumpet to really, or the center, if you look at it that way, to really have a say in her life, because God forbid that she gives up that control. So I think like what Owen Barfield shows us and what you get from it is that we're both, we're light and we're shadow. And we got to be careful to make sure that that balances out. And it's not that the shadows necessarily bad, it's just a part of who we are, and we just need to incorporate them together. So that's my opening thoughts.
Wonderful. And I'm going to keep that question, are they one or are they separate, as the big question going forward. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
It's funny that that is something that Erik brought up, because that's something from the very beginning. I was very struck by the way in which the twins were described at the very beginning of the novel. My initial thought was, these cannot possibly be one. We're looking at two pieces of a whole. And then the witchy lady reinforces that belief within me when she says, as long as one exists, so must the other be. And I think you see that because they seem to be extremes of, if we negate one side of ourselves, then we find ourselves in the extreme of the other. And for me, there were things that were described within the novel that were like exaggerated versions of things that all of us do in pieces. It's the idea that nobody is really going to run around singing and dancing all the time. We hope, all of us, that our life has that within it. But I think that it's a matter of, we need all of the components. I think ultimately what the story is saying, that you can't ever just be Violeta, and you can't ever just be, just the king, or you can't be either one of them. Like, all of them make little pieces. I mean, even when one considers, it doesn't make any sense how the king would allow himself to be fooled by Gambetta, and marry her, unless you consider that the two are one, that there's not actually two separate beings. Like that, to me, in my mind, this is the tale is told from the perspective, perhaps, of a child. It could be, a child might see an adult and see in them two different people. And yet it's one person. And maybe the way we view ourselves internally is slightly more of a childlike manner, and such that we do think of ourselves like, good and bad. Those are words they're distraction words. We get so caught up in these concepts of what is good and what is bad that we already create a divisive world before you've even said more than two sentences. And I find that this tale is an invitation to step to the side of that and consider other perspectives, and the idea of, the silver trumpet, the way in which they reacted to it, like, where we're told that the most surly side of us can be tamed with an unnamed outside entity. And yet we see that what's considered the good, Violeta is considered the good, right? But she's the one who did not put any importance to this outside entity, which was so vital, this silver trumpet. And in such, it caused her death. I mean, it truly, you can pinpoint that to the cause of her death, because if they had the silver trumpet and had been able to tame Gambetta occasionally, like they had done in the past, perhaps Violeta would not have found herself dead or in the ground for the time that she had been. And so I think that's ultimately what we're being told, is that every one of the aspects of our inner selves has tendencies towards one side. And while there's a lot of, there could be a lot of good or a lot of bad, there are other pieces that can change that. But it all exists within the same one person, because everything, I like the use of the flute when considering all the other main characters are like actual human entities. The flute was considered an inanimate object because I think it makes it easier to consider that something like, something ephemeral, like a consciousness or a subconsciousness, because it sits outside of a human. And so that's the fulcrum, as it were, of the story. And we know that from the title of the book, right? There's no surprise there. And yet, even knowing that, it's so easy to forget it, because it's introduced almost as though it were not so monumental to the story, until you start to get an inkling that is something is going to be huge with the silver trumpet, when at the wedding it's just lost. It's just and I never understood the cavalier manner in which Violeta was able to just forget it. Like, if I'm in bed and I don't remember if I locked my outside door, now I don't have a lot of expensive possessions in my house, but just the nature of worrying about my own personal safety, I'm going to go and double check to make sure it's locked. So I can't imagine being able to sleep soundly when there's something that in your mind is of import, and you can just set it to the side. And so we see that this supposed good within us can be lulled into this false sense of security, that everything will be as we leave it, even if we ignore potentially important things. And as we see, if we've read the story, it's not necessarily true. So I thought it was an interesting way to unfurl those aspects. That I see it as the interplay of the various selves that live within us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Folks, I'm going to invite people who did the reading, and Phil, because he introduced us to Owen Barfield. So we'll go with Phil, and then if Ambika and Penny want to go, and then we'll go with everybody else. Initially, we are only taking comments from people who have read the book. Okay, so we're going to start with Phil, and then Ambika and Penny, and then Joe. Phil. So Phil, let me do one thing. Let me ask you that one question at some point. If you could answer that, the question is, what is Owen Barfield saying in this book at some point? Go ahead.
Right. Well, I just want to comment on Evanik's proposal or question about.
No, what we'll do is let's put everything on the table. We are going to come to all. We'll do comments on all the questions all together. Okay, let's see what everybody is bringing up. Go ahead.
Right. Well, that's actually, I guess it just speaks to what she was talking about. I'm not trying to answer a question, but anyway, the thing that struck me from the very beginning was this idea of twins, right? So in some way, that's a hint right there. You have these two girls, they're exactly alike, so alike, in fact, that the king asked for a device to tell them apart. And how are they separated? Well, again, this is another important thing. They're separated by a different naming convention, right? And Barfield is a philologist. We have to remember that. He's a linguist. It's all about names and meaning that those names carry in them. And as it was already mentioned, Violeta and Gambetta, or Violet and Gamboy, they are in fact different, and their names are somewhat symbolic of their differences. And so Violeta is more whimsical and musical and more dancing, and she is more artistic in that sense. And Gamboy is more calculating. She is more. So in some ways, it's pretty obvious that in fact they represent something that needs to be balanced out, like it was said, and the trumpet is what keeps them balanced. Now, what is the trumpet? Well, in my mind, the trumpet represents art, an artistic, something that really speaks to our heart, not to the head, not to the analytical side of us, but also it brings some order to our being, right? Because we, like it was pointed out, Violet is somewhat disordered. She's disorganized. She's flighty, and music is what brings that perfect balance of, on one side, the joy and freedom, but on the other side, some orderliness in that. And that, to me, probably is the message I think that Barfield is trying to convey, is that if you start to err on one side or the other side, trouble is going to follow. And there needs to be that balance that's brought about by, again, by art, by music, maybe, even, we talked about imagination some of the previous times, but I think that's the message of the entire allegory, is that it's that something that speaks to us, and we all know the effect that music has on people, right? It can have amazing effect, soothing effect, calming effect. Even sometimes people get guilty about, they feel guilty about things they've done just by listening to some beautiful music. It just kind of pierces our hearts sometimes. So I think that's the ultimately the message. I want to point out one other thing. You remember what Gamboy was reading? She was reading this magazine called Amalgamated Princess. And there is another sort of hint, amalgamated, right? Something that's kind of put together, but not necessarily in the right proportions. And that idea of, again, bringing into balance what's not in proportionate, right? And one other quick point, if you remember the spell that the witch put on them was that Gamboy was going to love her sister more than anything in the world. The problem there was that she didn't specify how much she was going to love her. And as soon as her love started declining, it didn't matter that she loved her more than anything in the world. She didn't really love anything else. And she had very little love to, for that to be meaningful. And that's, again, it speaks of imbalance, and something that I guess is really relevant for us today is this imbalance of one side versus the other.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up, let's do the trumpet again. Rooty tootity 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 too tooty tootity 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 too rooty too Ambika.
So here we go. So since Owen Barfield speaks so much about meaning and language, I just felt reflecting on the archetypes and motifs in the story, which we see in other stories as well. I mean, there is a story of the Frog Prince in the Grimm fairy tales where she has to kiss him for him to come back as a prince. And then there are other motifs, again, the names and the sister, the shadow and the light and dark. But interestingly about the names, Gambetta comes from gamba, which is leg. And we notice she has a problem with one of her feet. And so there is that imbalance in her, whereas Violetta is delicate and beautiful and all of that. And also the name of Prince Courtesy, isn't that amazing? And he's always being very courteous, and it kind of fits him, and he becomes King Courteous. And then Prince Pirio, I think from what I read, it's a play on the name period, which means things returning cyclically. And so he goes in search of, Courtesy went in search of the woman Violetta, and this one is going in search of Lily. And Lily's name too, which suggests purity and innocence and rebirth. So she's born to Violetta, and Violetta passes on for a period of time, and then And then at the end, Lily is the rebirth, the mother returns and she's brought back to health. So we have some of these really lovely motifs playing again and again. And there was a word which comes, I think, in the first chapter, which was about toasting something forza tusten, which is about, forza means strength, and tusten is to drink a toast. And that's what they were doing, is to drinking to the strength of the king. And then silver is a great conductor. And so when we have the silver trumpet, not only is the material a conductor, but it's also a precious metal. And then the music that comes through silver, we speak of silvery tones and silvery voice and bringing back to life. So we have that beautiful sense in the music and the sound, and I also see it as core sound getting within in the center to bring things back to balance. So that was, and the frequency. And so which takes me back to, frequencies for healing, sound healing. And so a lot of these become relevant across cultures because we've read fairy tales in all our cultures. And we've also read, English fairy tales and Grimm's and, Anderson and so on. So there are all these motifs and archetypes that keep us, they're not foreign to us after a while. So I really like that. And of course, bringing things, the cycle. This is happening, the king goes, the daughters eventually get married and they dress up well. At age 21, they can choose their dress and their hairstyle. They've come of age and they're pretty and, and one chooses typically what she would have done, the stern look, and the other one comes very pretty, like a cloud. So there are all of these very lovely visual cues of their natures and how the story is going to unfold. And we know the darkness is coming in because we have that in all fairy tales. We have that in our mythologies and archetypes, even in Bollywood. So in all our stories and in our lives, we deal with all of that. So I think this is partly what he might have been speaking about. And ultimately, what brings balance back into life and well-being? And that's how we end. And I'm really glad to see that it ended with the good returning. And that doesn't mean something won't happen, but this is how we move forward in life. So this was fun. And there is the Black Book. It's the amalgamated princess is also called the Black Book, and she does black magic. And so all of these are prevalent in all our societies. So it was interesting that we read this for children and introduced them, and also to confirm and affirm that good does return.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ambika.
This happened.
Thank you.
And there were 5 fiddlers and there were 5 readers. Isn't that awesome?
Wonderful. Now, the last of the reader here, I think Rupali, I may or may not be able to make it. So last of the reader is Penny. Penny, would you like to comment? And then we'll go with others. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I mean, everybody said some really great things already. Of course, you can see that these are like characters when you read about them. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is, even though, Violet is actually, I think, much more attuned to the world, and she's concerned about other people. Everybody loves her because she's a person who really is interested, I think, in other people and what's going on with them. But she finds delight in life because there's so many things that were delightful. Whereas on the other hand, her sister really has a very jaded perception of reality. She doesn't look at all about what the world really is. She has this preconception about the world that she's got from her books or something, like when the prince arrives and she's, oh, well, he's conceited, they always are. And Violetta is saying, well, you haven't ever met one. How can you say this? How can you say he's conceited when you've never met a prince? But she knows everything. But she really she's got these ideas from reading in her own mind, but they're not really based on reality. They're just based on her, the things that she's gathered in her own mind. So I thought that was interesting too, the juxtaposition. Actually, that Violetta, I think, was much more focused on the real world than Gambetta was. And but the trumpet, of course, is and maybe it is music, like they said, or art. It's something that takes you out of your routine, that pulls you out of the mindset that you have all the time and makes you sit back and kind of open your mind to another reality. And so for both of them, and for everybody who hears it all at once, they're not in their routine anymore. All at once, they're like a child in a way. They're looking at the world and thinking, oh, what's going on here? Where am I? What, and it's taken them out, and they have this moment of enlightenment. And then when they stop playing the trumpet, they all want to talk about it because it was so exciting, but then all at once, right away, their old way of thinking sets in. And so they all go back to their own tasks and don't reveal to each other the wonder of what has just happened, which of course could extend what happened. But instead of extending it because they talk about it, they all hide it. So I thought that was interesting that, people are feeling something, but then they immediately go back.
Wonderful. Folks, this is just such an incredible tapestry of observations that I'm going to have trouble doing any kind of summarization. So I'm just going to focus on questions. So the big questions I have so far is, one, are Violet and Gamboy one? And second one is, what is the silver trumpet? I want to just head back and see if Maritza or Ambika wants to put any other question on the table, or you can put it up anytime. So folks, collect questions. So what we're going to do is that in the beginning, people will make observations and ask some questions. And then at the end, you have one more opportunity of putting questions on the table, and then we'll go into the discussion. All right, now we will get to people who have read the book. So we are going to start with Joe, followed by B and Jeannie, and then Ella. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have read the book and you would like to comment on what you got from the book, and if you want to put some questions on the table. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to this the other night, and thank you again to the readers, because they actually did a fabulous job. I mean, on Sunday evening, it really was a treat to listen to. I see one of this idea of love and fear as being two really important themes in how Gambetta and Violet actually engage with the world. But love in a very interesting way. There are a couple lines in there. I mean, now love is what breaks the spell, right? Loving the prince more than loving Game Boy or Gambetta. That's, what actually breaks the spell that allows her to, love the prince more. And I think that shows you the power of love over spells and things along those lines. But I think really important line that I thought that, and I would really like to get people's thoughts on, is that when he wrote, there are two ways of loving people. One is to like seeing them happy, which was Violet's way of loving. And the other is to do what you tell them to do, which is Gamboy's way of loving. I thought that line is actually profound. What does it mean to love? That question, and it leaves it open. Like, so does Gamboy really think she's loving Violet? I mean, by doing some of the things, is she just severely misguided? This kind of gets to some, kind of philosophy. Does anybody do wrong intentionally? Is she just ignorant? And I thought that was a fascinating point. I think that the fear factor that Gamboy has is also critical. I mean, and Penny already took one of the things that I wanted to speak to, is the idea that, oh, he's a conceited prince, that there's this judgment that the world is actually out, is already wrong. And even that when the boy is getting the apple, or Violet sees the boy crying and she gives him the apple, and she felt for everybody else, that she has this open, this loving nature about her that is completely in contrast. But one's based on fear, if you think about it, and the other one's based on love. So I really see that is a really important theme between these two. There are a couple other just lines that I just thought were interesting. When they're marching up and the flames, they're looking at the house and they're saying, oh, they're warm and we're cold. There is an interesting line. It says, look how the roof is smoking already, cried the neighbor. But they were talking about the mob, but they only thought they had seen things because they wanted to see them. And it was the perception, this is what the mob was feeling at that particular moment in time, is that the castle was warm and that they had everything that they needed and that they were cold. And, no matter what they saw, they were going to see that their perception of reality was distorted already. And I thought that was an interesting line too, because that also comes from a place of fear, that was actually created by Gamboy. The other is the moment that they were actually all very happy together and listening, the three of them together when they were listening to the music. And they said that, there was a warm breeze in their face. And the prince asks the little fat podger, why do you think that was last night? And the interesting, answer was, music hath charms, said the dwarf. Harmony, harmony, form versus chaos, light versus darkness, and the dominant seventh. It's all one. And it's interesting because I think what it's calling attention to in that particular instance is the power of music, of the arts, as Phil kind of alluded to as well. And I also think that there is this element of, there's an important element of not fearing the other throughout the book, whether it be, all of God's creatures as they talked about it, except I think they make the exception of I think they make exceptions for lions because lions probably eat them. But anyway, if I recall correctly, but in any case, I think it gets to another point. It's kind of seeing the beauty in everything. It's not necessarily just seeing the beauty in people that are like yourself, or, it's actually proposing you to look beyond physical beauty and to see the inner beauty that people have. And that's what's really transformative, as opposed to some of these external things that we tend to value more than internal things, especially when we're talking about, her father even says, love all of God's creatures. I think it'd be interesting to explore, if anybody has any opinions on, I don't know much about, and probably Phil does, Owen Barfield's background and belief systems, but I know Tolkien and C.S. Lewis both had strong religious beliefs. So, I was just wondering, as far as, what are the religious overtones, maybe would be an interesting thing to get people's opinions on. And what does this really say about love? I think that's kind of, it's much more deep than just love is good and fear is bad. It's there. Love is very complex, and I think the complexity of the love between the two is really interesting to dissect. I mean, I have a couple of other questions, but I will leave it there.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to put the question of, is love versus fear a theme of this story? And what are the religious overtones here? Next up is going to be B, Ginny, Ella, and Allison. B, go ahead.
Hi, Shant. So I just finished reading the book, 5 of 9. And most of the comments people have already made have touched on things that I wanted to mention. I actually didn't realize or didn't think about the two sisters as one persona till it was mentioned. And of course, my first thought was, what's the meaning of this silver trumpet? But I did want to add one more comment about love and fear. I think when Prince Pirio was in the tower with Lily, and they talked about fear is what keeps people from understanding each other. That's how I interpreted it. And I immediately thought more expansively on people from different nationalities, different backgrounds, different races, that because you don't understand somebody, you are afraid of them. So that I thought that may have been something the author was addressing or not, but yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Wonderful. Thank you, B. Next up is going to be Ginny, followed by Ella and Allison. Ginny.
First of all, I thank you for introduction to this book, Phil. And I was thinking, my son was really into reading as he was growing up, and he read all of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and all of these books. And yet I was never exposed to this book, and I felt so badly. And I saw him today and I told him about this book, and I said, I don't know how I missed this book. But anyway, with respect to the silver trumpet, this is my thoughts, that the silver trumpet seems to, even if momentarily, brings out or balances each person that comes in contact with the sound when it is blown. The balances them out. I think Ambika mentioned that earlier. And or it brings out the positive quality of the person who is listening to the sound of the trumpet. So it's almost it's almost as though it's like an angel temporarily comes and touches each person in the form of the sound of the trumpet. And whether it be a gambit becomes more sensitive and kind, and then I believe it was Julia, who is the granddaughter of Violetta, right? Is that correct? Who loses her fear and becomes courageous, if I remember correctly. And so it's almost as though the trumpet is like an angel touching each person when it's played. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Ginny. Next up is Ella, followed by Allison. Ella.
So many great comments. Just a few things to add at this point. With Violetta, she's representing purity. She's very caring, honest in the moment, and loves life and accepts people. She's trusting. Gambetta, fearful. all interpretations of events and other people are jaded, negative, based on fear. She runs them through a sieve in her mind and comes out with a negative formula, no matter what she's addressing or who she's addressing. She's highly manipulative, planful, not honest. And I'm not, I think from the hints in the story that so many people so aptly covered that they are archetypes, and that we all have, perhaps some of these elements, to one minimal extent or the other. But of course, they're dramatized to make the point. And the conflict, it seems, is it's almost like there's a warning, because it's a children's book, maybe in a subtle way. But back then, things were written a little bit more to the point. But it's almost like there's a warning to be aware of evil, because it can steal your joy, your life, your energy, and to guard yourself a little, and to balance yourself. And the trumpet is to change it up, a little bit of transcendence, to go where the music goes, and get out of the dance, the conflict, and move past it. And those are my thoughts. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Okay, let's do Rooty tootity 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 too 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 tootity 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 too Rooty too. Allison.
Thank you. So I read it today. I was going to do this on Sunday, but the Frankenstein was so good. It went on for 3 hours, and I was kind of wiped out after that one. But I read the whole book today. And what okay, so I have to start with, I am a massive C.S. Lewis fan, and I have been since I was a child. In fact, when I was a kid, my friends and I used to act out all the scenes from every book during recess, and then we'd make up more. And then as an adult, I've taught his books. So, but it was very interesting to read this. I really wanted to read this because you had said that C.S. Lewis was influenced by him. But one of the things that I found that was really interesting was this whole idea of the two sisters being like two different sides of the same coin, and that you could be, the really good, kind, loving one, or you could be this mean, nasty sister, and that both of them. And I liked how the idea how it was kind of like the two sisters were two different people, but they were sort of one person at the same time. And what I think is really interesting with that idea is how it parallels then to C.S. Lewis, because this book was written after World War I, and the Chronicles of Narnia was written after World War II. And you don't see any reference to the war in this book, but in Narnia, you really do, because the children in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, London is getting bombed, so they have to leave the city because of the bombing. And then they go into the wardrobe, and then they go into Narnia. But I feel like what both authors were doing was they were trying, when you have these two massive wars, this good and evil is inside all of us. And that, when during times of peace, everything is, you see the goodness come out. And then during times of war, another side of people's humanity comes out. And it's really up to each individual to wrestle with it and to make the right decisions. So I feel like it's very interesting seeing how they both had this in common. And then also, like in Narnia, you've got the White Witch who basically casts a spell and has to be, essentially broken by love and with Aslan. And the same thing here, where Gambetta sort of casts a spell over this castle. And in both of them, it's love that breaks the spell. And then, there's a lot more of like the Christianity in Narnia that I don't even get the references, and I've read it a million times. Each time I read it, I get more like, oh, that's what that is, and that's what that is. But it's really fascinating to watch the lineage between this story and the others. And I just was riveted by it. I was just sat here for a couple of hours, couldn't put it down. I tried reading it. I was listening to it at first, and I thought, oh, it'll be 4 hours. I can read it faster. But I should probably go back and listen to it too, because I did listen to part of you guys, and great job to everyone. But yeah, I just worried about time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Folks, before we do the seconds, if anybody who has read the book wants to comment, I particularly want Brian, what did you think? Would you like to comment? You need to unmute though.
Okay. Yeah, first of all, I'm very grateful for this book having been selected and for the readers. What a great way to be introduced and to work through the book. I really like what everyone has said. I now feel like I'm finally understanding the arc, the great arc of the story. When I was listening to it, it seemed like many different children's stories included in one story. That was I'm sharing now what my reaction was at the time of the reading. And I thought, honestly, I thought that was great. There were a lot of, I felt like you could have drawn conclusions or like Aesop's fables, drawn certain lessons at many different times in this story. And that to me was a fascinating part of it. The Podger, the role of Podger, I thought was great in that he's kind of the jester that I'm used to in fairy tales and Shakespearean plays, and is often used as a great device to introduce truths into the story. The thing I liked about this one was that Podger was also sharing truths with different people in the story, not just with the listener. And so that, I thought that was really, that's the one thing that struck me as really interesting. It was, to me, a very rich and complex story. And I did have in mind your question, what was Barfield trying to say? And honestly, at the end of it, I had no idea. So I really appreciate what everyone has shared here.
All right. Thank you, Brian. So I'm going to go ahead and make my comments, and then we will go to questions, and then we'll put everything down. So I'll try to answer my question. What is Barfield trying to say? I think this is the heart of this whole thing, is the sound produced by the silver trumpet. That is the heart, that is the center. So think of it as a diagram. Let's say that top in this case is the center. That is the high, that is basically truth. What is true? What is good? What is beautiful? And that is being captured when the trumpet sounds. That we've been studying Gospel of John, we've been studying Bhagavad Gita, we've been studying Tao Te Ching. That is Om. That is the word. That is the Tao. When the trumpet sounds, that is what is brought into consciousness of anybody who's listening to it for the moment. That is what the story is about. So it is a profoundly religious story. Now, so think of it as at the top. If you want to draw it, you can say that, you can put the silver trumpet, not really the silver trumpet, it's the sound that it produces, right? The Rooty tootity 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 too tooty tootity 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 too rooty too. That sound is reminding you of the truth for a moment. That is the center of the story. Now, you can look at the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Left-hand side is what happens to you inside. It is your emotional nature. And the right-hand side is your action. Okay, so it has something to say about how these both sides interact with the truth and how they interact with each other. So the left-hand side is the inner. It is your emotions. More profoundly, it is what is called a sense of life. It is your emotion towards life itself. Do you think life is worthwhile or not? Do you love life or do you fear it? Life as a whole, not a particular thing. That is what is being captured by Violet and Gamboy. It is one in the sense that you have a sense of life and you can have it partly positive, loving of life, saying yes to life, and partly negative, saying no to life and fearing life and everything about it. That is what the sisters, the twins, are about. It is portraying the inner. But there is a parallel that nobody has spoken about. And that is that in action, in physical reality. And that is captured by the prince and the toad. Prince is one who sees life as an adventure, values to be pursued and achieved. Winning princesses, going on adventures, killing dragons. Toad just sits there in fear, and there are lots of toads. So it's the story of Violet and Gamboy and Prince and the toad interacting. Just like Violet and Gamboy can turn into each other, Prince and Toad can turn into each other. Further, these left hand and right hand are not both separate. They have a profound relationship between them. The prince needs Violet, and the toad inside is Gamboy. Let's follow the rule of the Lord, the namer Lord, who made it simpler. Let's change the names to actually capture what these people are. So there is the prince and the toad. Violet is the princess that goes with the prince. And Gamboy, let's call her the toadess, because they go together. If you are a toad, the way you feel inside is like Gamboy. If you are feeling like Gamboy inside, you make even princes into toads. So toads and toadesses go together, and prince and princesses go together. Prince and princesses are actually focused on the truth, on the sound. But you have the potential of being a prince or a toad at all times. You have the potential of being, being a princess or a tortoise at all times. So internally, you have to keep focusing on the truth, keep focusing on the sound in order to keep growing. For example, when Violet says, I have the prince, I have happiness, I don't need the sound anymore, then she actually turns, gets scared of the toad and dies. When her daughter Lily, who is a princess, how did she become a princess? Because she grew up on the knees of the prince who gave her the outside, the courage, because outside and inside depend on each other. So she had that. So she was a princess. Moment she started being scared of the toad, scared further by the tortoise, Gamboy, she became a little Gamboy herself and locked herself up in the tower. It's only when the trumpet reminded her that she asked for help from Miss Thompson. And then she had the courage to face the existence of Toad, because truth is everywhere, covers everything. It includes, just like Prince is a part of the world, so is the toad. Just like Princess is the part of the world, so is tortoise. So anybody who is focused on truth sees all these things. They are not afraid of the toads. They're not afraid of the tortoises either. And that's why they can be a prince or a princess and move towards the truth. And so that, to me, is what Barfield is saying. So that's my take on it. So I want to open it up for I think there are 3 people who had exclamation marks. All of them are readers, so I'm going to go with them now, and then we will go to questions. So it's going to be Ambika, Maritza, and Evanique. Ambika.
I was just going to add about the silver trumpet, that it is the inner calling of the divine that brings, listening to which brings things back into harmony, which once it got stuck in that loft somewhere, people forgot. And when they forget this, they lose touch with their own, beauty and courage, and that fear comes in. And when it is sounded, things start to come back into center. So it is that core. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Next up is Maritza, followed by Evanique. Maritza.
I had wanted to bring up the prince whose name was Courtesy, because I found it interesting that the princess who's attributed to the side of the light, she made the statement that she no longer needed truth since she had courtesy. If you're looking at it the way I viewed it, because I viewed the trumpet as being the ringer of the truth, and so I think that was quite a huge cautionary tale. That if we get so caught up on, like, we remember Owen Barfield, he was into words, and so sometimes courtesy is a way of lying either to ourselves or to others. And so if you get so caught up in courtesy, then you're not you lose sight of what is truth. I also found it interesting that when he arrived at the mountain, he was told by his father, he was sent with his father's blessing and told, seek adventure and love. And he only sought love. And so without the fortitude of the adventure, he was unable to be he couldn't take any action. Everything for this prince, everything happened to him. He did nothing in the story. everything happened to him. And then we see his other side, because, you know, his twin kind of was Prince Pidio, and this prince did not get his father's blessing. In fact, his father told him the opposite, you know, don't go, you're being foolish. So he went on an adventure. And so he did adventure first. And then when, through no fault of his own, you know, he was turned into a frog, minding his own business, right? Well, he had the fortitude now to try to get past this thing that had befallen him, because he had already lived. He had been stretching his life muscles, as it were. And so he was able to act. And so I thought that was just an interesting distinction, because I really found that the prince, I mean, this story really does nothing for you gentlemen. I hate to say it, but it really doesn't. The men here in this story are just weak. Maybe not entirely Prince Pidio, but definitely the main character, Prince Courtesy, just, he did nothing. He did not one thing. Everything happened to him. So I was wondering, maybe if I were to pose a question, I would be curious on other people's thoughts about the word courtesy. Do we think then, or maybe I'm off base, do we think that it is a question of, you know, finding a proper balance in life for this, you know, courteousness, which is pleasing others, and seeking truth, which is, it's not a aspect of pleasing anyone, but you're appeasing your own true self by giving yourself a voice.
Wonderful. I just want to comment very quickly on what you said. I think that's a great observation, that courtesy, he was given the trumpet by his dad. And, you know, he saw the effect of it, yet he was willing to give it up. Just because, you know, while it looked at him a particular way, okay, that was all it took for him to give it up. And then he actually turned into a toad. Not only that act killed Violet, but then he became a toad. He was just sitting there drinking his coffee, drugged coffee. That is what toads do. He became a toad. And the contrast with Pirio is that he pursued an adventure on his own. He got turned into a toad for no fault of his own. Courtesy chose to be a toad, and then was saved by Pirio later on. But a great point. Thank you. Next up is Evanique, Allison, and Brian. Evanique.
Yeah, one thing that struck me was that Lily had to embrace the toad. If you're talking about the toad being a symbol of fear, Lily couldn't run, like she tried to, in a sense, like she locked herself up in a tower because of fear, and all it did was increase her fear. So it's a symbol of when you lock yourself out from the world because something happens and there's fear, or you perceive something and it's fear, and you lock yourself up in the world, all it does is it increases your fear even more, and it grows. And the only way that Lily really could break free from that tower was to kiss the toad, or embrace the toad, or love the toad. And it was funny because once the trumpet was played, and she thought about what was worse, death or continually living in fear. Like she realized that she lost about a good 10 years of her life, maybe even more if I have the math correct. I think like 12 years of her life she lost due to fear. What was worse, her staying in that tower or death? And she chose death. And it's funny that she chose death because she had to die to her own fear in order to live her life, in order to embrace the toad, which was really embracing adventure. that's why Prince Perio came back to life, I think, or that the embrace brought him back to life, because she embraced that fear. But embracing the fear means you go on the adventure, which means a part of you has to die. You have to die to not the feeling of fear, but letting the fear control you. So I just thought that was an interesting point about Lily. And I think Lily, you could see, started off as Gamble. Well, she started off as Violet, right? She was this adventurous little girl. And then, Aunt Gamboy got, and increased that. Well, first she was fearful of the toad because she remembered subconsciously that was what killed her mother. Like, she didn't know that was what was going on. She was 2 days old. But it shows, like, Owen Barfield talking about the psychology of, I guess, of trauma, that even if you don't remember it, it can still stick with you. But then her father talks her out of it, and she's like, oh, okay. And then Aunt Gumboy, being fear, puts her right back in that spot. And then there she stays. And part of that is because first she's going to go to her father. And then Gumboy convinces her, no. And how many times do we do that? Oh, nobody wants to hear about our problems. Nobody wants to hear about our fears. No one wants to hear about our expression of our feelings. And then we bottle them up, and then we keep them inside. And then we create our own prison. And then it's only to embrace the fear is when we can come out of that. So many different things in the story of Lily. And eventually, you see Violet come back, and that's coincidentally when she marries Perio, is when Violet actually comes back out. So it's just one of those things that this could go on for hours, but I'll stop here.
No, that's great points. I just want to make a couple of comments here. See, the deep theme here is the center and the periphery. Truth is in the center. The toads and the tortoises are sitting in the periphery, afraid of each other. Okay. Now, to take over, to basically face your fear, she faces her fear when she gets hold of the truth. And once you have the truth is the center, the eternal principle that is shaping everything. Then toads are part of the truth. And therefore, you're no longer afraid of them. So you will act in spite of your past emotion that is making you afraid of them in order to do that. So I think it is the contact with the center that frees you up. Anybody who is focused on the center are not only afraid of toads, but they're not afraid of tortoises either. One of my favorite parts of the book is when Prince Perio goes and just picks up Gamboy and starts to, kind of bang her up and down as a pile, because that is, otherwise everybody is afraid of Gamboy, just like they're afraid of toads. But that's excellent points. Next up is going to be Allison, Brian, and DLJ. Allison.
Yeah, I was thinking like a minor theme in this is this idea of how you have to listen to yourself about love, because Violetta, before she says yes, she goes to her sister, should I marry him? Oh no, he's conceited, and she does it anyway. But I think the thing that's really important about that is that you really do have to listen to yourself, because you're the one who's going to have to live with this person. And her sister wasn't doing it from a place of really caring about her sister. It was because she was jealous because she didn't have some prince coming after her. It was just, so luckily she didn't listen to her. And then, she had a happy marriage, or at least as long as it lasted. But then also Prince Perio, the same thing, where his father's like, oh, what are you doing? You don't even know her. But he needed to listen to himself. And I think, especially when you think about when this was written, 1925, prior to that time, most of these marriages were essentially arranged. It was about a financial transaction between families. And this is kind of marks that turning point when people were starting to marry for love, not just for, mixing together the families. So I think it was a really important time. And even today, sometimes, when people are making decisions about who they want to be their partner, people chime in with all kinds of opinions that sometimes aren't really based on what's best for that person. It might be jealousy, it might be, oh, we want you to marry this kind of a person and this sort of family, this sort of money, this sort of whatever, but not really looking at, like ultimately it's about someone's heart and whether or not it's a good heart. That's really what it's about. And so I think it's great that in the story, both of those people tuned everybody else and they went with their own heart and followed their,
I thought that step, just like Joe pointed out, that step of she going to Gamboy, saying that I'm going to marry, and that scene, I think, is a crucial part, because what happens is that your subconscious, your emotional mechanism has an integrity. That is what is meant by these are twins who loved each other more than anything else, because all, even bad parts of your emotion are felt as yours. And that's what the emotional state is. So in that sense, that is what is meant by Violet and Gamboy loving each other more than anyone else. Then Violet sees the value of truth, positive things in the prince. And that love for that is the one that enables her to put that above Gamboy, which is actually a part of her. So that is a very profound, profound step. Thank you. Next up is Brian, followed by DLJ. Brian.
This is
Penny, go ahead.
and this is kind of a theme on the truth, but the viewpoint of like deceit, because I thought it was interesting in the story. There were several clear examples, like a cautionary tale to children about being deceived by people. I think one of the first ones that was clear was when Gamboy went to the townspeople and was telling them all these untruths, and they all believed it, even though nobody even knew who she was or where she came from. But they believed what she was saying. They didn't question it. Nobody tried to find out the real truth. They didn't go ask somebody, did they ask a servant who worked at the castle, is it cold? Do they have fires? Are they eating pheasants, And then I think the other one, which was clear example, was with Lily. And when, she was frightened of the toad, and she never liked her aunt. But as soon as her aunt started to be kind of nice to her, and so she felt like she was grown up, and then her aunt says, well, don't tell your dad, And so she really wanted to tell her dad. She's always talked to her father, but then she did not question or go to him. She was deceived. And then, Gamboy deceived the father in the same way, saying, oh, everything is fine. Don't talk to her. So I just thought this was a really a cautionary tale about just accepting things without really thinking about them or trying to see if they were the truth. Going out and looking yourself a little bit to see what really was the case.
Thank you, Penny. I found the characterization of the townspeople very interesting, because they are also kind of combination of toads and princes in one, because they get very easily influenced by Gamboy, but at the same time, their love for Violet doesn't go away. The way when they see they have the prince in front of him, they do the right thing. They immediately, so they have both these things, elements within them, just like everybody else. So it's great. Next up is DLJ, and then we'll go to all the questions. DLJ.
Thank you. Yeah. So I was trying to pick out some themes from a conversation with Phil regarding Barfield's main ideas. So the only one I managed to get was the term figuration. So this is about how we interpret the information we receive. So lots of different characters doing that in different ways. But I think the main two worldviews, if you like, were fantasy and reality. And I think for me, the castle represented the bubble. And anybody who stepped outside the castle would be seeing reality more. So that includes Game Boy, actually. So I think, did I say Game Boy? Gamboy, sorry. She was book learned to start with, right? From which you can get some view of reality, but she also stepped outside the castle, right? And of course, to pick up on Penny's point, I got that in my notes, deception is part of reality. So we are getting close to Baudrillard's simulacrum, or if you prefer the movie version, red pill and blue pill. So to me, the trumpet was kind of like a blue pill. It was like putting people back into the fantasy mode, and outside the castle was the reality. Although sometimes a distorted view of reality, which the peasants had. The thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, though, it was a subtext. It wasn't, I don't think, the main one. But do you remember Courtesy? Prince Courtesy was told by his father to go on adventures and then find love, right? Which he didn't do. He went straight to a castle, found love, right? Whereas Prince number 2, Pirio, had an adventure. He walked around the world a couple of times, then found love. So he was the one who then had the greater understanding of reality. So the two characters that represent reality most, so Gamboy and Pirio, one was on the cynical side, having seen the world and hating it, and the other was on the more positive side. And both of those characters, I think, more than any, were the two where the strong message, I think, is about taking control of your own destiny. So Gamboy was doing that, and the second prince was doing that. This is actually, I think, a strong theme from C.S. Lewis as well. So the children originally are kind of led along by the story, and then eventually they realize that they've got to take control of their own destiny. Same as Frodo. So you can see the whole Inklings thing. They've got the same kind of idea, taking control of your own destiny. So I think that was the strong message, and whether you do that positively or negatively, I think Wonderful. Perhaps is the idea. The other bit I just want to touch on is just the writing of it. I mean, I didn't really, some of the characters you just thought, yeah, whatever, but you know, fairy tales. But I really did like the Stable Boy, the way the Stable Boy was written. And I was really going through different accents in my mind. I was trying it with an Irish accent and a Scottish accent, definitely West Country. And I love the word Fenarius. Just beautiful. Because that's, yeah, I just like, that was my favorite word in the page 39, the word Fenarius. That's very much.
Thank you, DLJ. I like the observation that it is really between Pirio and Gamboy. That's really, Gamboy is like she's the toadess who is leveraging all the toads, whether it is mechanical toads, physical toads, the toads that are there in the townspeople. She's leveraging all the toads and trying to destroy all the princes and princesses. Whereas Prince Pirio is a prince. Prince Courtesy just happens to have landed in a right place, you know, while he was through his, and somehow got hold of the trumpet, which he himself did not do anything. So I really like that observation. So, okay, let's now go to the questions. Folks, here is another chance for you to put down questions. So currently I have the following questions on the table. Now go ahead and type a question mark in the chat if you would like to add more questions to this. First, are Violet and Gamboy one, really one? Second, what is the silver trumpet? Third, is the theme of love, motivation by love versus motivation by fear, a core theme here? 4, what are the religious overtones in this? And what is the distinction between Prince Pirio and Prince Courtesy? Those are the questions I have, 5 of them. If you would like to add any more questions, go ahead and type a question mark. Otherwise, let's take them one by one. I really like these questions. So let's go with first question, which is really the core. Are Violet and Game Boy one? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to make any comments on that question or provide an answer. We'll start with Joe.
Well, the spell kind of makes them one. It links them, it links their emotions. So in a way, they lose their own independence in that process. So you can argue that they're one in that regard, and that they're linked to one another. But are they one, physically or something along those lines? No, I mean they're separate. They're twins. But the spell, removes their ability to be their own independent self. It actually removes their ability to actually be angry, and it removes their ability to actually be happy in certain cases. So I think that's, are they one? I guess so. Emotionally, they're tied to one another.
Thank you. Next up is Phil.
Yeah, I want to add to what Joe was saying, and also just to mention that, let's not forget, this is a fairy tale and it's written for children, right? Primarily, not for adults dissecting and analyzing what we're doing. So when you're writing something for kids, you can't write something like Proust, or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy and start examining a single person's inner world. What do? Well, you create characters that epitomize certain characteristics, right? And typically you can have opposites, right? We think in opposites, right? Light, darkness, love, hate, fear, courage. So these two characters, these twins, they, in a lot of ways, they are they're twins, but they're opposites. So there's that unity and oneness, unity and oppositeness in one. It's kind of Hegelian in a sense, right? Even though it's a fairy tale, it's pretty deep concepts of how opposite traits are really reflections, mirror reflections of the same thing. And so that's how kids can understand these concepts, and how I think we could interpret them as both a literary device and a deeper truth below that, underneath that device, which is they're really representing something that is true of all of us in various degrees. And then the story ends by kind of this cycle and rebirth. And I really like the interpretation of cycles in the story, how when something is out of balance, typically nature brings it back, or whatever, nature or some other force brings it back into balance. And so we end up with Game Boy becoming Violet, right? And so again, there's that unity again, right? Anyway, I think that those are my comments.
Thank you, Phil. Phil, from all the reading I have done of all the books, I think this book is out there in terms of the profundity. I think it's far more profound than most adult books that I have read. The way I see this question, I would say that they are one. They are one, and they are showing you different kinds of state this one can be in. In the beginning, you have the positive and negative going back and forth, affecting each other. Then, when Violet dies, that positive part dies. And then the world of the castle and that kingdom is now shaped by the negative part. The Violet is in the ground, and Game Boy, the negative part of the psyche, rules. And then when Prince Perio comes back and brings back the trumpet and plays it again and again and again and again and again, and makes the truth physically real, and truth conceptually real through playing of the trumpet. The Gamboy, who's alive, turns into Violet, and Gamboy goes into the grave. So the positive remains at the end. So it is one, which was both the mixture was there before, then it was only the negative, and then there is only the positive. So I would say it is one for that reason. Next up is going to be Ella.
Thank you. That's just a quick point on those ideas. Indeed, the twins and the spell created, although they were opposites, they were joined. The Hegelian unity was mentioned. Perhaps I'm thinking that the point or the theme would be to individuate, become oneself. And another point, if someone can stand outside of the group and not become enmeshed in the group things that are going on, such as they were inside the castle and even with the townspeople, as what was the second prince's name? The young prince,
Perio.
Perio. As Prince Perio stood outside, if someone can stand outside of all the people and all the pressures to not be yourself, if they can stand outside, their essence may affect others in positive ways. So individuation and standing a bit apart from what's going on, being yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Ella. Let's go to the next question. What is the silver trumpet? What, at the deepest level, what is the silver trumpet, or more fundamentally, what is the sound that it produces? What is it that the sound? So let me make it the sound the silver trumpet produces. What is it? Ambika.
Well, you're the one who makes the sound so well, Shrikant, but is it the teachings of the gospel? Is it the voice of the divine that brings people back? The flock, it's, calling the people to come back together and listen to the word, that kind.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Maritza.
I suppose I could see how someone religious would equate that to this religion. I view it as truth. Or if we were to look at it with a religious undertone, I suppose, the song of God is what's considered to be, the ring of truth. So I suppose that they could be viewed similarly, but I don't think that it is required to have a religious bend in order to see that as truth, because that if one doesn't want to be religiously inclined, I think that it's it could be the way or the path, or it's that which rings true, as it were.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I mean, when I bring in all the religions, really it is their way of capturing truth. It is really about truth in all formulations. The secular formulation and the religious formulations are simply trying to say, what are the eternal principles that are true, that are shaping everything? And what the trumpet does is it reminds you of that. What happens is most of the, if you look at the reaction of people to hearing the trumpet, is that they were kind of lost and fragmented. Their entire focus was fragmented in their day-to-day things, and they're just doing certain things, they're feeling certain things. Suddenly, they wake up and they remember the core of their being, core truth, for a moment. And that exactly what is, as I see it. Next up is Evanique.
What I see the trumpet as is consciousness. You know, in the beginning, when you first hear the trumpet is in the beginning of the story, and Violet listens to it and she's awakened in a sense, like, you know, she's brought into consciousness, and that's her first separation from Gamboy. And, you know, Violet kind of coming into her own and really embracing the truth or consciousness. Then you hear it again. It is so funny. Like you hear it in the beginning, and it kind of brings, even it calms Gamboy down, and it makes her less rough, right? So, but then you don't hear it again until the stable boy, towards the end of the story, accidentally plays it, but he doesn't know. But all of a sudden, this people are awoken again, or awakened, right? They're brought back into consciousness. They've just been existing. And so if you apply that, and then at the end, when Perio plays it, you know, again, like it's fully awakened. So if you look at that in terms of life, is at that point where you come into consciousness, and you're really like, oh, in a sense, you're embracing life now. It has you embrace life. And I like what Phil said about its artistry, or it's an art form, like any art form that brings you back to life, which is what art forms does. Like it could be anything. Like for me, it's music, right? I love music. And, you know, for me, music is what calms me down. It can also, like, it depending on what type of music, can it make you want to dance. Another, it could calm you down. It could speak to your soul when you're hurting. You know, music has all these different qualities that it can do. So I think it's what the trumpet is, a symbol of whatever brings a person back to consciousness. And for different people, it's different things, but it has the same effect in that it makes you aware of your feelings, and it makes you aware of what you're doing. And it has you, it brings you back to life, I think.
Wonderfully put, beautifully. This is a core theme of Owen Barfield. When Phil did his meetup on Owen Barfield, you know, my summary of Owen Barfield's thought was, language has the power to produce a felt transformation in consciousness. And this is exactly what is going on, that they feel a transformation in their consciousness, and it is happening only for a moment. And the interesting thing is that how people use it, like Prince Courtesy uses it just to reduce the irritation that Gamboy is producing. That's all, only temporarily. But Prince Perio uses it relentlessly until Gamboy dies and is replaced by Violet. Okay, so it's a question of how do you focus, and the relentlessness with which you focus on the truth, not just to say, oh, I remember, I feel different, and okay, now let me, you feel ashamed of it. That's the reaction that most people have. You feel ashamed, and then you go back to what you are doing. There are people like Lily who make the decision. But remember, like first time she says, who is this vagrant people? You know, they're not supposed to be playing this music. Similarly, you know, Prince Courtesy says, you know, I'm going to put this person to death, whoever is playing this. That is their reaction to it. And then her reaction is that, okay, my life has completely fallen apart. Send for Mrs. Thompson. So it's really interesting, you know, what people do when they hear the trumpet. Wonderful. All right, let's go to the next. They're great questions. It is definitely a battle cry, and it represents harmony, art, and beauty. So I think, I mean, one of the core ideas here throughout, you know, pretty much all of Western thought, definitely Indian thought, I'm sure, and of Chinese thought, is truth, beauty, and goodness go together. That so it is truth it is beautiful, and it is good. And all of that is being captured in one. Next question, let's take Maritza's question. What's the difference between Prince Perio and Prince Courtesy? What's wrong with Prince Courtesy? And what is it that Perio has that Courtesy doesn't have? Next up is Ambika, followed by Evanik and Joe. Ambika.
You know, I did that when you were talking about truth and beauty. So,
please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, beauty is truth, truth, beauty from Ode on a Grecian urn, you know, Keats's poem. So all of those things bring that back to us. That's what I was going to say. Joseph, Joe, thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Evanik, followed by Joe.
I like that point that Maritza brought up about Prince Courtesy. And the whole point of being courteous, but not being truthful, and it's almost deceitful. Because I think sometimes I think we're taught to be polite, right? We are taught that you don't say the thing, like you don't say the obvious thing, even if you think it can help, because it might hurt the person, or it makes people uncomfortable. So courtesy to me, besides Gamboy, really didn't make people uncomfortable. Like Maritza said, he really did just sit there and allow things to happen to them. And you see that in a lot of people today, that they just allow life to happen to them. And they don't see a way out of it. And so they just kind of go through life courteously, just go with the flow. And, if they have dreams or anything, they don't go for them. And, it was so funny when Courtesy got to the castle, he said, I'm looking for love and adventure. And the king at the time tells him, there is no mountains, there is no dragons to slay here. There is no adventure here. As far as love, you have to win over the person. And let's face it, Violet was easy to win over because she had never been outside the castle. This is the only person the only male probably outside of the servants that she's been exposed to, besides the boy. And so it was kind of an easy win for them. And a lot of people go for the easy. And I think that's a symbol too, people just going for the easy. And so with Prince Perio, I think he's the catalyst of the story, in that he just goes off of a picture. And he's like, I'm going after. He didn't know if Lily was going to accept his proposal. He didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't know what was in his future. He didn't even really know how to get to Mountainy. He had a compass and that's it. And then he realized he's going the wrong way and he has to figure it out. And the thing about Prince Perio that I like is that, he walked around, his boots wore down, he worked for a week, he got what he needed, and then he moved on, right? He just kept going until he got to that goal. And then he didn't know what was going to happen once he got there. He didn't know anything about Mountainy. He didn't know anything about, if they were even going to let him in, but he just went for it. And in a sense, Perio is also giving up your past. In order for him to go into his future, he had to give up his past. He had to give up his father, everything he knew, and everything he grew up on, to go on this adventure. And he embraced the adventure. Even when he got turned into the toad, and he thought like losing the picture of Lily was the worst thing, he realized he still had the letter from Miss Thompson, and he was going to get to her no matter what. Like, it was going to take him longer. The toad, he had shorter legs, but he wasn't, even when he physically became a toad, he did not allow himself inside to be a toad. He just worked with what he had and he kept it moving until he got to Miss Thompson. And then he rested a little bit, and then he got up, and then he kept it moving till he got back to Lily, back to the castle. He just kept going. So even though he was physically the toad, and Gamboy turned him into toad and tried to put that fear in him, he was like, I'm still going to keep it moving. So I think Maritza is right on point, where between between Courtesy, who just let life happen to him. He let himself go under this Gamboy's spell, and Prince Perio, who had a spell put on him by Gamboy, and still was like, nah, I'm still not stopping. Like, being turned into a toad could probably be like one of the worst things that could happen to you. And he was like, I'm still gonna go. So
no, that's wonderful, Evanique. Absolutely. I mean, I'm just seeing so many contrasts now that Maritza has started it and you've built up on it. You know, Prince Curtis shows up with this entire set of horses and the silver trumpet, and Violet is there. And what does he do? Under his watch, Violet dies. And he does nothing about all of that and becomes a toad. What does Perio do? He leaves everything. He was a prince. He leaves everything in order to pursue the adventure. He goes through, you know, shoes and backpacks and all kinds of stuff. Keeps going. He can't find a place, starts to wash dishes. And then when he comes, by the time he reaches his princess, he's a toad. And the princess herself has become a toadess. And the entire castle has become a toad world. And he transforms all of that while he's a toad and does all of that. So that, and Maritza, I beg to differ from you. There is a strong male character here. I don't see anything. So next up is Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
can I just make one more
Please,
point
please.
really
Yeah.
quick? And notice that when Courtesy lost the trumpet, he never even bothered to look for it.
Yes.
Just wanted to point that out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe followed by Maritza. Joe.
I mean, there's definitely an active part. I mean, that's actually already been stated here with Prince Perio, you know, going out, leaving his, you know, his comfortable environment and seeking his love. And despite the fact that he was actually going to, you know, lose all his wealth because you know, in going out and looking for the woman that he was in love with. And there's an active element to that as well. It's interesting though, I see that, yeah, there's definitely criticisms to be had of Prince Courtesy. But I think they both go on an adventure. I think they just go on them in reverse. They both have their experience. It's just one of those that you really don't want to have. And so I think one is, yes, you're pursuing. One is actually actively pursuing and embracing the challenge. Whereas the other one is passively in they're going through, but they're both going on an adventure. I mean, they're both having an experience. So I kind of disagree with this idea that they just did it in reverse. And I mean, and in fact, there's a discussion as to shouldn't be adventure first, then should it be the queen? And then he wins the queen's love first. But you know, again, I just think that one's passive, one's active, but they're both having their experiences. And one's more painful, one's perceivably more painful than the other. You know, it's that, you know, that he's dealing with unrest, he's dealing with a bad sister-in-law, and we don't know what Prince Perio actually eventually ended up like. And, you know, I mean, that's the other end of it. I mean, we don't know what he ended up dealing with. So he ended up happy, it seems like it, but we didn't get his whole story. I just think that when we talk about adventure, you have to specify if it's slaying lions or something along those lines. It's one thing, but they both have experiences, and you would rather be active than passive.
Thank you, Joe. So another thing that occurred to me was the difference in which they use the trumpet. Okay, now firstly, trumpet fell into the lap of courtesy. Now what the trumpet does is that it wakes up people from their sleep. That's what the trumpet does. It's an act of consciousness, of being awakened. That's what the trumpet does. That's the heart of it. What does he use it for? He uses it for temporary elevation of pain from Gamboy. That's all he does. And then when his dad has told him, lose your life, but don't lose the trumpet. Because, and that is actually profound, because if you lose the trumpet, the life, or if you lose the truth, the life that you have is not going to be worth living. That's what it means. And he promptly gives up the trumpet. And as Evanik was pointing out, doesn't even care to find it. Now Perio discovers the trumpet and its power. And the moment he notices it, remember that he's putting together what this trumpet is from what the Podger has said, what the stable boy has said, what effects he sees, and he deduces all of that. And the moment he sees that it is a device to wake people up and turn them towards truth, he just keeps blowing it until things change. So that's another example. Thank you. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Ambika, B, and Allison. Maritza.
So I think that I'm going to both agree and disagree with Joe in the same breath here. So sure, Prince Courtesy still had experiences. We all do. If one is breathing, one is having experiences. The question is, do we want to be battered perpetually by the wind and land where the wind drifts us? Are we going to go through life drifting as drifters, as second-handers, as it were? Or are we going to intentionally put one foot in front of the other? That's what we're shown here of the juxtaposition between Prince Courtesy and Prince Pirio. Prince Courtesy did nothing in this tale. Everything happened to him. All his experiences, every time he shows up in the story, something was happening to him because of somebody else's action. There's almost nothing he did there. I mean, we can nitpick and be like, well, he actually physically put the trumpet to his lips. Sure. We all occasionally have to take certain actions, but I'm talking the big picture, walking that meaningful path type of movement. There was none, at least I saw none for Prince Courtesy. Prince Pirio did. He had to go against the wishes of his father in adversity, because we're talking, another thing that Prince Courtesy does for us is he lets us see how it is that one would expect a prince to travel. They travel with all the horses, with all the pomp and circumstance, and it's a very pleasant, protected, chaperone journey. And then you see Prince Pirio has none of that. He has to do it an entirely different route. And I think that would be the distinction the author is making between an experience and an adventure. And to me, it's just a stark contrast, because you see Prince Pirio taking action. He decides to not pay heed to his father's advice, and he moves forward. Every time he's confronted with an obstacle, we're told that he makes a decision, and sometimes a plan even, to find a way. He may have to stand still. He makes a decision, well, without shoes, I can't move forward. I have no money, but I refuse to stop moving forward. So I'm going to willingly take a detour and work. But I'm giving myself a time frame, for when I want to be back on the road. We see that in the tale. And so I feel like it's super clear that he is intentionally walking his path, whereas nothing in Courtesy's tale shows him doing anything intentional. And that's, and I view that as a very clear point to us, and maybe caution to not just drift along in life. Because I mean, how many years did Courtesy lose just in a stupor? And just oh, by the way, he gets a happily ever after through nothing that is his doing. He just happens to be the lucky bystander who, you know, Violet and Lily love. And so he tends to flourish because of that.
Thank you, Maritza. I want to point out one more thing. I mean, I really love this book. I love the plot of it, because what it is that Perio is Prince 2.0, and so is Lily. Lily is Violet 2.0, because look at Violet and what she does, and look at the courage of Lily. You know, she goes through this entire process. You know, go ahead, Maritza.
I just want to, one more, something you just said, just like a light bulb in my mind. Perhaps what we're showing is that so long as we view it as twins, we cannot have the courage that we see when it's Lily. We have to view it as Lily. So long as we view it as both, we can't get there.
Exactly, beautifully put. Exactly. I mean, that's what that was he's saying. Like, if you look at Prince Courtesy, he becomes a toad. He becomes a toad. He lets Gamboy turn him into a toad without anything, you know, willingly. He becomes that. He lets Violet die. Thanks to Lily, he kind of comes to life a little bit, but again dies, and then doesn't protect Lily. Lets Lily go down, right? So basically he is both. He has Prince and Toad because he doesn't ring the trumpet often. You see, that's the difference. You see, you have to go root toot like that. You have to keep doing that, and you have to go rooty too, rooty too, rooty too. So continuously you have to keep doing that, and that's what entire life of Perio is about, right? He has it kind of pretty, you know, very nice, and then he sees this picture and he says, oh, I want that. That is what his father is telling him. No, you're supposed to marry into wealth. He's very rich and it'll be very nice for you, very comfortable. He says, no, I would rather lose all of that. He goes through everything. Poor guy goes around, comes back to the same town once because he doesn't have even a map, but doesn't give up. He deals with Podger the right way, and Podger helps him. Thompson helps him, then everything kind of becomes a toad. So anyway, so I like this idea of 2.0 because it's not just kind of looking at, you know, what these characters are. There is a progression. And the point that you made is that it is pure. You know, at the end, you have the pure positive outside, which is Perio, and pure positive inside, which is Lily. Thank you. Next up, let me see here, is going to be B followed by Allison. B.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the idea of the toad we've talked about as fear. I think toad is also barriers in life. It's a metaphor for obstacles that we have to overcome. And I also see Prince Perio as a very strong character. I don't see him as a weak male figure in this story. I also see it as a psychological drama. I'm not sure Barfield, well, yeah, there's I think we do get into the head of the characters. Even though as I was reading this, I kept thinking of Sleeping Beauty and the witch that puts the spell on the baby and the other fairy tale. Forget the name of that, but yeah, that's what I want to say about Prince Barrio. And I just saw a comment which is a little startling and interesting, and somebody suggested that Prince Perio and Courtesy are possibly the same person too, which is puts a whole different spin on everything.
I don't think those two are the same people. I think Prince Courtesy and Toad are the same people, because there is that two things going into one another, exactly opposite things, which is not going on with Perio. So
well,
that
it's possible that, well, I don't think it's the same person, but it's possible that that idea that Courtesy becoming Toad, I think of it as barriers that, you know, all of us face obstacles or things that we have to overcome in life. And
that's a very good point, B. Absolutely, I agree with you. Because what happens is that when you go to the periphery, we use the the analogy of kind of center and periphery. What happens is that when you are at the periphery, you're separated from everything else. It's also very interesting. I think Maritza had pointed out last time that the Toad did not have any ear holes, so couldn't hear anything. So they're not really responsive to reality. They can't move much. So they can't move from like Perio did from all around the world. They're just kind of sitting in their own pond. And that itself is a tremendous obstacle. Now, the question is, we will have parts of us like that. The question is, are you going to work with that? And are you going to keep going? Are you going to find kind of universal principles? Are you going to find the center? Are you going to be inspired to do something about it? And that's all is a tremendous work if you're a Toad. To the extent to which you are a Toad, it's a lot of work. And you have to be willing to do that in order to go beyond that. So wonderful, thank you. Next up is Allison.
Sorry, Maritza, but I disagree with you. I don't think that these princes are weak characters at all. I think, and Ebonique saying that they didn't have any adventures. I disagree, because I think marriage is a huge adventure. Sometimes a good one, sometimes it's not so good, but it's an adventure and it takes tremendous courage. It really does. And I think, and especially Perio, I mean, he traveled around the world 3 times in order to find her. I mean, took tremendous conviction. And then I think Prince Courtesy, I mean, I think he was, overcome with grief and fell into a depression, which, many men do when they lose their spouses. Some of them immediately remarry, and then some of them are just spend the rest of their lives missing their wives. And, so I don't see them as weak at all. I think, I think they're very strong characters. They're just, they're strong in a different way, but I think they were very strong characters.
Marissa, would you like to respond to that?
I suppose that is one way to look at it. I will stand by my perspectives on how I viewed them. I think that the moral of the tale is, we're looking at actions, and I don't see any actions there. I mean, life is hard. We all get depressed, but if we all just sit there and sip coffee, we're just drifting.
What do you think of Prince Perio?
I think Prince Perio, you're right. I will correct my stance on that. He did have to go through a lot, and he did show conviction, and we are shown time and again he had hardship, and he did make the decision to keep moving forward. So I will correct myself there. Yes, Prince Perio was a strong character, but I really don't find Courtesy to have been anything. useful. Not useful. There was use to him, but he was a drifter. He was the cautionary tale of what not to do in life.
Wonderful. Now we cannot go away from this discussion without discussing the little fat podger. What do you guys think of little fat podger? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to comment.
Could you repeat that question?
What do you think of little fat podger? Next up is going to be Evanique, followed by Joe.
I at first, he reminds me a little bit of Geppetto from Pinocchio, or the conscious, like the good conscious, or the wise person. Like, he seems silly, but in the beginning he seems silly with the right step. You know what? Now that I'm thinking and talking it out, I think he's the combination, in a sense, of all of the characters, right? Because he can have joy in life, right? You see him in the beginning as joyful, but yet he has such wisdom that he first gives to Prince Courtesy, warning him about choosing of who to choose, and warning him not to choose Gambetta, and informing him to choose Violetta, right? And he does make his mistakes. He is, like everyone else, he's flawed. And the main thing is that he made the toad suit without ear holes. And that, in a sense, unintentionally, which we all do things that are unintentional, but yet we make the mistake, right? And so he's distraught about that mistake, and you think he passes away, right? But then he goes into, but what really happens to him is that he goes into the town, and he recovers. And he waits for the moment that he can return to the castle. And he goes on and he lives his life. And then when the time is right, and he runs into Prince Perio, again, he gives sage advice. This is the type of person that, gives the sage advice again. And, he brings the truth in. And so I always think of him as the character that brings the truth. And he speaks the truth. And to me, I love the Podger because he's honest and he's good. And he's one of those people that he's whole. He goes for the adventure. He makes his mistakes. He moves past his mistakes. But he's kind of he's kind of the person where, even though he's not the main character, he's a very strong character. And sometimes you don't have to always be the main character in the story in order to be the strong character in the story. So I like the Podger. I think that could be a whole meetup in and of itself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's what, again, I love about this book. You have a character like that, kind of, and he's linked to all the other characters, and he's interacting with all the other characters. So just wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Joe. And folks, after this, I'm going to ask you the question. Last question is going to be, what did you get from this book? Go ahead, Joe, on Podger.
I like the Podger. I mean, I do. I think his whole goal is to, bring joy. He's an honest fellow. And I really like the fact that he wasn't executed. I thought that at the scene at the end was, quite touching. When was it Lord Tully? I forget his name, or Lord Hightower, who became Lord whatever, basically had, said yes, he had slipped away. And so I think that he gave sound advice to the king, and he wanted to do nothing but good. He obviously got duped by Gambietta or whatever. I forget. I keep going back and forth between Gamboy and all that. But anyway,
She's called Todes. She's called Todes.
there you go, the TOTUS. But yeah, I mean, and he felt terrible about it, but he was, you know, again, he was something that sought nothing but to bring joy and to the lives of the people that he was around. So I quite like the character.
Wonderful. All right. So finally, final question. What did you get from this book? What was it like? This is the first time we have gone through a children's book. What do you guys think? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. Would love to hear from everybody. We'll start with Evanik, followed by Joe.
Okay, so what I got from the book is that we are all these characters at one point in our lives. We all drift like Courtesy at some points. We are all adventurous like Perio at some points. At least I hope we are. Some people maybe not so much, but I hope we are. At some point we are all Gamboy, maybe not to the extreme of Gamboy and killing people, but or orchestrating the killing of people, but we can all be caught up by fear. You know, I think for me, what I got overall is to take the adventure, right? But be wise about it. You know, take good parts from all of these characters. Like sometimes you have to be like Courtesy and drift because you can't take any more action, right? So, take the action that you can and then control what you can and then let what happens. So I think that's one theme. I think from Gamboy, you could take the simple fact that she was smart. You could not deny her smart. You could not deny her wit. And you couldn't deny that, she had a great mind. And if she had used that mind for good, we would love her. If she had really, her and Violet are two of the same coin, in that if they had just allowed, if there was that balance between Gamboy and Violetta, that's a powerful woman. Like that's the arc of a powerful woman. And I think in a sense that's Lily. I think if you look at Lily, that's her. So I think there's just so much to learn and so much to grow. But I think the lesson is to take the good out of every character and see where you can use it in your life. That's what I got out of it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead, followed by DLJ.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting tale about, I really think it depicts the human condition of fear and love. I think it really is a lot deeper than even what we've covered here this evening. I think there are certain lines in there that we could dissect a little further. So I don't necessarily think we got to everything, but if I said that, if I think that, there some of the major themes is to this idea of being open versus closed as well. I think people that are afraid are very closed and fixed in their worldview and their mindset. Even DLJ mentioned the castle itself was like a bubble, and I think that that's a good way of actually capturing that. It's a very fixed perspective on reality versus having an open perspective, and having open on a number of levels, even to the point where that Courtesy did come into the castle. He was somebody that came into the bubble and became part of it, but it was something of an acceptance that had to happen. He had to win Violet's heart, So there's this element of love, I think, that's overriding. Again, I thought the dynamic between the sisters was really interesting. The spell itself, and what it means to really care about somebody else. I think that was a deep, profound question that has a lot of thought behind it. But I think it's, if anything, it's being open and open versus fixed. That's how I kind of say my takeaways.
Thank you. Next up is DLJ, followed by Allison. DLJ.
Yes, thanks. Good comment so far. Good analysis. I enjoyed it. Yeah, the main moral of the story, as with most fairy tales, I think, is stay away from princesses and toads.
Thank you, DLJ. Next up is going to be Allison, B, and Ella. Allison.
I think what I got from this the most is that I really, really loved watching all of your minds attack children's literature, because I live in the land of children's literature for 9 months of the year. And it's really wonderful to see all the things that you pull out of it.
Are we doing a better job than your students? Miss
Different job. It's Miss, well, I shouldn't say my last name on here.
Okay.
You know, it's really interesting because kids actually pull a lot of these things out, which is fascinating, but they only have like 9 years of life experience, and you guys have so much. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, I think the difference is they usually get to the characterization really, really well, but they can't hop back and forth between different times in history and different books and young and, you know, archetypes. They can't do any of that, but they get the characters really, really well. So that's, I think what's fun is that you guys are getting the characters and then you're throwing in philosophers and all this other stuff. So I hope we do more children's literature. I really think it's fun.
I mean, the only other one that I know of this caliber is Alice in Wonderland. I don't know of anything else. Of
C.S. Lewis would be really amazing.
C.S. Lewis would also be. I'm not familiar with him, but I'm sure he's at that level too.
Yeah.
Next up is going to be B, Ella, Nicole, and Maritza. B.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I loved reading this fairy tales, which is for children and adults. And I spent my whole life using children's literature to teach English, which was my profession. I especially loved this story is full of magic. And so this is the appeal for children. And as adults, you know, it's much more profound in everything we pulled out of it today. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Next up is Ella. Ella, go ahead.
Yes, I thought it was a really good book. And I also thought it was sort of a sad and somewhat heart-wrenching tale of reality. We all know gambatas in life, male or female, and we may work with them. They may be in our families, fixed, controlling, manipulative people. And I think what I need to focus on is to know the way, to know my truth and the truth, if I can, to investigate what that is, to see both sides, and to still keep moving ahead, and not to get held up by it, by reacting to it. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thank you, Ella. Next up is Nicole. Nicole, what did you get from this book?
Well, mine is kind of a combination of the book and the free poetry writing. And I have pending court cases, so I probably shouldn't comment on the book.
No, just on the book. You can comment only on the book. Go ahead.
Oh, I like the Rudy Tooty Tooty.
Okay.
Tooty.
Thank you, Nicole. Nicole, your sound is you're breaking up. Thank you. Next up is Maritza.
So I read this book, and it's a fairy tale. I saw, it's interesting. It made me think of the real fairy tales before they were changed to be palatable for children. They're just more grim, and this one didn't end grimly, but I feel like somewhere there lives a version of the story that doesn't end so happily, because I could just see it in the making. I'm
sorry, I cannot resist this. Yes, the stories used to be very grim, and they were also written by many Grimms.
Yes, exactly. I feel like we need a little boom. So I liked seeing the admonition again, this whole, to be true. Really, to me, that's the real thing here that we're being reminded of. Like, it's all great to just be here in fantasy, but fantasy is not reality. And if we forget that, trouble arises. And even something as, seemingly innocuous as a toad becomes the great evil if we allow it to. So I think that's and I think that most children novels in general, they are kind of guiding lights for, right and wrong, because that's when that's the formulary years, right? So that's what they're trying to figure out. And hopefully novels are supposed to be pointing them in that direction. I will say I would love to hear, it would be fun, Shrikant, to have a session of people providing their favorite childhood book or two and the why. What about it speaks to you? Like even not just children's novels, but like in the young years and in the teen years, like books that really speak to you, because I just think that would be an interesting thing to hear.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. Now I have a question for Phil, because Phil is the one who introduced us to Owen Barfield. And when I talked to Phil, he had not read Silver Trumpet. He's extremely familiar with all of Barfield's work. So the question I have for him is, where does Silver Trumpet fit in the entire corpus of Owen Barfield? But more importantly, what do you learn about Owen Barfield from this book, and how are themes in this book connected with all the themes of his writing? Go ahead, Phil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think I've learned more about Silver Trumpet in this meetup than I, got from it reading on my own, which of course speaks to the value of doing it together like we are. So I think a good segue or connection with Barfield's work is this book that he wrote called Worlds Apart. And this book is all about the compartmentalization of our knowledge and our experience. And so in that book, he describes, he brings a fictional set of people who represent mostly science, but also some philosophers, a person who studies religion, and a philologist, of course. And so, and they talk about initially past each other, but eventually they start to see that they have a lot to learn. And the worlds apart, the tight compartments, he calls it, is something that prevents us from seeing reality in its fullness. And I think this simple fairy tale, in a lot of ways, presents the same story. Because as we talked about, both Violetta and Gambetta, they are in a way two sides of the same coin. And Prince Perio and Prince Courtesy, the same. I mean, they both have something that they both need. They love each other, right? Violetta and Gambetta. They are attracted to each other because they're one. There's that unity there. And even though the princes themselves are not related, they fill the same role, and so they have that same unity as well, and but also differences. And I think the way this fits in with Barfield's overall sort of themes that he explores is he looks at, we talked about the evolution of consciousness that he traces through language and how language unlocks the changes in consciousness, but also how it reveals the imaginative part of our experience, right? Something magical. And the silver trumpet, of course, is that. In a lot of ways, silver trumpet has the same effect as poetry. We didn't talk about poetry, but when you hear poetry that transforms, like we talked about, that felt change of consciousness, right? Silver trumpet brings that about. Poetry brings that about. So that's the connection. Is whatever experience we have, it can be better if we listen to a silver trumpet. And what is that? Well, it's our connection to something that is not analytical, something that is not just purely material. It's something that's hard to quantify in a lot of ways. Beauty, art is not easily grasped with quantitative tools, as much as maybe people would like them to be. I'm glad that we have something in the world that is purely qualitative, like music, art, poetry, and it makes life richer, and it touches us just like silver trumpet does, and it transforms. And if we let it, it can bring some sort of balance to our lives. And I think that's Barfield's point in a lot of ways, is that we have become too much once lopsided in our thinking and our experience, and we need to rediscover in a lot of ways meaning, music, harmony that's present and latent in poetry, in art, in music. So
wonderful. Thank you, Phil, and thank you again for introducing us to Owen Barfield. Again, thank you to all the readers for reading this for us. It's been amazing. So I'm going to end with this. Rooty tootity 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 too 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 tootity 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 too rooty too good night.